Hello, I'm Charlie Beall, Chairman and CEO of eKnowledge, a company that develops multimedia e-learning products. I'd like to talk with you about Ron Paul, a candidate for President of the United States. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm 55 years old and until now have never actively supported any political campaign. Honestly, I've never trusted politicians. Big government is about dividing people, not bringing them together. It's about politicians pandering to different ideological, racial, and religious groups, each with its own agenda, separate identity, and special interest. It's about the use of force to control minorities and individuals. I've always believed that big government is the enemy of freedom. So I never thought there would be a candidate for president who was worthy of my respect and trust. That is until Dr. Ron Paul cured my apathy. Because of Ron Paul, millions of Americans are rejecting the divisive politics of big government and are joining what has become the greatest grassroots political campaign in American history, a campaign based on the message of peace and freedom, equal justice, and prosperity for our country. Ron Paul's campaign for president is bringing Americans of every race, religion, and socioeconomic background together with a shared vision and clearly defined objective: to restore the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights, to strictly limit government's power and control over our lives, to protect the privacy and personal freedom of every American, to guarantee equal justice in our society, and to put an end to a long-standing foreign policy defined by diplomatic incompetence, financial corruption, and military intervention. Ron Paul is the only candidate for president who is committed to the principles of limited government, individual liberty, and peace. Since the founding of our republic more than 220 years ago, Americans have never faced a greater threat to our individual liberty than we do today. But the threat to our freedom is not from Islamic terrorists or foreign military invasion. It is from our own government, the leaders that we have elected to serve and represent us. The threat is from the highest officials in our government, the Democrats and Republicans who have betrayed our trust, violated their oaths of office, dishonored our Constitution, and alienated our country among the community of nations. There is only one candidate for president who has never violated his oath to protect the United States Constitution and who has stood alone as the defender of our freedom. That candidate is Ron Paul. Politicians will always try to convince us that we should allow them to confiscate the fruits of our labor and use them for the collective good, that we should trust them to always do what is best for us. But when we allow career politicians and government bureaucrats to assume that level of power and control over our lives, it disrupts the natural and proper order of things. In other words, government intervention distorts our natural sense of right and wrong. It undermines self-confidence and personal responsibility, and it discourages the voluntary and independent decisions that build personal character and self-reliance. Ron Paul is the only candidate for president who wants to remove the burden of big government from our lives so that we can realize the full measure of our potential as individuals and as a free and just society. As Americans, it is our birthright to live our lives without constant government surveillance, intrusion, and control. It's our natural right to be free, to live in peace, to care for ourselves and for our families, and to be left alone if that's what we want, so long as we do no harm to others. Ron Paul is the only candidate for president, Republican or Democrat, who respects the right of every American to be free, to be secure in our privacy and possessions, to be left alone and allowed to live in peace according to the dictates of our own conscience. Following the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Ron Paul stood as the lone patriotic voice of reason and wisdom in Congress. Because of his devotion to the Constitution and his loyalty to our troops, Ron Paul refused to give President Bush the authority to invade Iraq without a formal declaration of war by Congress, which is mandated by the Constitution. He refused to ask our young soldiers to spill their precious blood in another undeclared illegal war. Before the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, Ron Paul knew what President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and every senior elected official in Washington knew, or should have known, that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction and was not a strategic threat to our country. How did they know? They knew because from the end of the first Gulf War in the early 1990s until the time that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, our military and strategic intelligence agencies were using fixed-wing aircraft and satellites equipped with the most advanced surveillance technology in the world to constantly monitor all significant industrial and military activity on the ground inside Iraq. Saddam Hussein could not have possibly developed the industrial complex required to produce the alleged weapons of mass destruction without our knowledge. Ron Paul warned us that the war financiers, the military-industrial complex, and their political puppets in Washington would use the 9/11 attacks to drag our country into another unjust and unconstitutional war. We are now paying a heavy price for ignoring Ron Paul's wise counsel and honorable leadership at that critical moment in our history. More than 4,000 American soldiers have died. Tens of thousands of troops have been maimed for life. Hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqi civilians have been killed. Hundreds of billions of dollars of destruction has been inflicted on Iraq, and the working people of America have been forced to pay more than $1 trillion for this carnage. And for what? What have we received in return for the sacrifice of our blood and treasure? Secret prisons, the unconstitutional Patriot Act, national ID cards, suspension of habeas corpus and our due process rights, surveillance cameras at every corner, warrantless searches and wiretaps, secret monitoring of our private communications, the torture of military prisoners, secret courts, 2-hour waiting lines and strip searches in our airports, widespread government fraud and political corruption, and hundreds of billions of dollars unaccounted for in defense and homeland security spending. Is this what we should ask our soldiers to die for? I don't think so. Benjamin Franklin said that those who are willing to give up their essential liberty for temporary safety will ultimately lose both. That is precisely what has happened in America. We have allowed our government to assume a level of power and control over our lives for which it has no constitutional authority. If America's founders were alive today, they would disown us as their countrymen.